For those in the booth, we're waiting on one more board member, and then we'll get started. And Heather was in the back.
She was in the parking lot. She has Chris and I
No, I want to respect folks' time, but we are waiting for one more board member. And we will get started. All right, thanks, Ms. Scott. Good afternoon. It is a little after 3, and this is the Wake County Board of Education's Policy Committee meeting for October. Welcome to all. We have all board members here, our Attorney Jonathan Blumberg, Superintendent Kathy Moore. So we have got a full house and a full agenda. So thank you all for being here. Just a note on the agenda, we had previously posted that we would review the RNP for teleworking, and that was posted without recognizing that we had done that over the summer. So the rules and procedures are already in place for teleworking, so that has been dropped from this agenda. So is there a motion to approve the agenda, the revised agenda as currently listed?
So moved.
There's a motion and a second to accept our agenda. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. So we'll have that revised agenda. And now I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes. Hopefully you've had time to review the minutes from the September meeting. Thank you, Dr. Martin, for chairing that.
So moved. Second.
There's a motion and a second to approve our minutes for the September 27th meeting. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. All right, with that, we've approved the minutes, and we'll move to our first policy, Equity 1150, which we have reviewed over several, going back more than a year, and now we've appreciate the thoughtfulness that's been put into these revisions, as well as just the work that Dr. Chavis, you and your team have done in picking up taking feedback from the board, from the community, and bringing this next revision to us. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Will Chavis, our Assistant Superintendent for Equity Affairs.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Policy Committee Chair Kushner, Board Chair Mahaffey, board members, Superintendent Moore. Today we are here to present to you the draft policy and stakeholder feedback to the draft, which was last presented to you on October 4th. I am joined today with a team of folks who will provide you with some perspectives, and I'll introduce them later to you. Next slide. I'll review themes in today's presentation which emerged across stakeholder groups. You'll hear perspectives from representatives of each stakeholder group and the impact of the draft policy to their respective work. And finally, we will seek your next steps with this draft policy. Once again, we want to highlight the strategic plan framework, especially for those who may be watching. Here we see that equity and excellence are now attached to the long-term goals of all strategic priorities, and equity-focused practices as an essential pillar. Having an equity policy will shape, guide, and direct our strategic work throughout the district. And it is here within the framework we will operationalize the policy and include metrics for progress in places where we will hold ourselves accountable for applying an equity lens to our work and the commitment to equity at all levels of the organization. Since the October 4th work session, staff gathered feedback on the draft policy from stakeholder groups listed on this slide. First, we have the superintendent's leadership team that's made of the superintendent, the chiefs, assistant, and area superintendents. Both the superintendent's leadership team and the equity committee of the Division of Principals and Assistant Principals previously provided feedback when the first revision was crafted, and again provided feedback to those revisions. The Community Equity Leadership Team, Wake PTA, to include their diversity, equity, and inclusion chairs, and the Wake PTA leaders all provided feedback and will be listed as family and community members in subsequent slides. The Superintendent's Teacher Advisory Committee, one teacher leader from over 140 schools were represented in their feedback session. And student voice is critical to this policy. I was able to have the student equity team from Sanderson High School to give their voice and perspectives of this policy. And finally, we were able to meet with new principals and share the policy with them to obtain their feedback in this district. Close to 300 stakeholders were able to provide feedback to this draft policy. On this slide, we have the timeline, again referenced by Chair Kushner. We worked on this policy, and this work on the policy began as early as 2011, when the Raising Achievement Closing Gaps Committee was meeting regularly. August 30th of this year, I presented the initial draft policy, which you were able to review twice in 2021, and got your feedback around next steps. From your feedback, we revised the draft policy and presented to you on October 4th, the work session. Feedback from stakeholders was obtained after the October 4th meeting, and we are here to present that to you today. So we'll go through the feedback now. Slide 6 here, as we think about the sections of the policy, the feedback will be provided to you by sections of the draft policy, Section A, Section B, and Section C. Section A contains the definition of equity. So general themes that emerge across stakeholder groups in this particular section. First thing to point out is that in this section, the themes were similar across groups. They appreciated a clear definition of equity, which is defined as both an action and an outcome. It was referenced in many of our groups that they appreciated having a noun and an action to the equity work in the definition. They recognize and were grateful for the expansion of inclusive listing of student characteristics. As an action, the definition of equity explicitly states the removing and removal of barriers that will allow access to all students. And as an outcome, when equity is applied across the district, we will eliminate the predictability of student outcomes. So I wanted to center, again, the data and the feedback was very similar across groups, but I wanted to lift the student perspective up because this is a student-centered policy. So those comments and the feedback from our student group is that the definition holds high expectations of all students, irrespective of background, while giving opportunities they need to be successful. Language contained in the definition is empowering, and this will allow students to see themselves reflected in the policy and their school environments, and may challenge them to even explore and identify barriers getting in the way of their success. In this definition, everyone has access to opportunity. There's a belief that opportunity exists, but not everyone can access it. Students cited examples of accessibility of advanced courses in their school as an example. And that this definition allows for everyone to be on the same playing field while accounting for various needs across difference. So we move on to Section B at this time, and this is the equity lens section of the policy. Section B of this draft policy requires us at a systems level and individual level to apply an equity lens. So again, general themes that emerge from this section. Stakeholders appreciated the board's acknowledgement of historical disparities that continue to exist and the predictive association to student outcomes. Lifting up and acknowledging equity benefits all students. There was an emphasis placed on the phrasing, progress towards equity is a process. Stakeholders believe it is important to note that this work is a process of growing, evolving, learning, understanding, and of action. Questions contained in this section of reflection are clear, specific, and explicit. And finally, stakeholders appreciated a systems approach of applying an equity lens to decisions, practices, policies, and programs, and an individual application for staff within their daily practice. So from our students, again, from Section B of this policy, I will be providing you feedback of each stakeholder group, as Section B was completely revised from the initial draft of the policy, and the board had asked several questions of this section from our last presentation. So on this slide, for our students in Section B, they stated that it helps to remove, that Section B helps to remove hidden barriers that may not be evident to staff. The impact of the questions addressing the application of the equity lens benefits students and their families. And this impact is what, as a student, called generational. When students do well, their families often do well. And when students do well in our school system, this provides future success for the students, families, and of our community. This section reinforces that school should be a place where all students learn to be their very best selves. And the influence and impact of teachers building and sustaining relationships is critical, and for the contributions their students make. Who they are matters, and that should be recognized, valued, and celebrated in all classrooms. So in Section B, we look at teacher voice, the Superintendent Teachers Advisory Committee. They believe questions 6 through 10 are specific, and they serve as critical self-reflection and a guide to understand and to act on equity. As stated by the teachers, the questions help to examine our own biases and those we may be unaware, while learning about our students across difference. Questions contained in this section can also be applied to school improvement planning and within weekly professional learning community meetings, but also serve as goals and key action steps for annual professional development plans that teachers have to do each year. And teachers, they made the comparison in Section B to existing resources and frameworks used within our district to include the EL resources and content, PLC plus resources, where equity is one of the 4 cross-cutting values. There are resources there that ask and guides through deep level of questions and processing our work and service to students, their identities, and their backgrounds. And then the second step program, a resource being used at the elementary level in supporting the whole child. In this next slide, you'll see 2 illustrations here, and I felt that it was important for there to be an extension of the alignment as we're talking about the questions in Part B, Section B of the equity policy. So the first item that you'll see on the left-hand side is the teacher evaluation and principal evaluation. And here you'll see a portion of Standard 2 of the North Carolina Teacher Evaluation Instrument. Standard 2 is titled, Teachers Establish a Respectful Environment for a Diverse Population of Students. Within Standard 2, teachers are evaluated to the following standards: to acknowledge the influence of race, ethnicity, gender, religion, socioeconomic status, and culture on a student's development and attitudes. That teachers use materials or lessons that counteract stereotypes and acknowledges contributions of all students. That teachers promote deep understanding of cultures through the integration of culturally sensitive materials and ideas throughout the curriculum, and that they capitalize on diversity as an asset in the classroom setting. The state is also piloting a new evaluation system that includes equity and existing evaluation standards and includes an additional standard for equity. The other illustration that you'll see on the right-hand side points to the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction 2019-2025 strategic plan. It explicitly states that the state is working to eliminate gaps between students by decreasing exclusionary discipline practices, decreasing high school dropout, increase the number of educators of color, and equitable access to economically disadvantaged students. In the section of increasing educator preparedness to meet the needs of every student, NCDPI calls on the increase of culturally relevant, equity-focused practices as one of the essential areas of focus. In addition to these areas, there are national standards of ethics, such as the National School Counseling Standards and the National Board Certification Standards, which requires ongoing reflection of student outcomes, examination of teacher practice, and addressing gaps in data, which again is reflected in the questions contained in Section B. This next slide I thought was important for you to get a chance to see and to hear directly from members of the Superintendent's Teacher Advisory Council. Two of those quotes in particular, the questions in Section B are checks and balance, or a check and balance for teachers who often get caught up in curriculum and not realize the role of equity. And the second quote you'll see there, the questions are essential for teachers to reflect on and consider if we're ever going to make strides with achievement gaps, suspension rates, et cetera. So getting back to Section B, in hearing from our principals and assistant principals, they gave voice to, or they lifted up the following, that Section B is explicit in communicating the priority of applying the equity lens and progressing towards equity. Questions offer reflection for staff and to their practice. The questions also provide administrators with prompts as they work with their staff in identifying and navigating equity challenges, which also helps in modeling individual and collective thinking, practice, and efficacy. And finally, establishes collective norms within schools and ways to live out and live through the equity lens. And then finally, we have the family and community members and feedback that they provided in Section B. Family and community members appreciated the board's ownership in holding ourselves or yourselves accountable to practices which will interrupt predictive associations to outcomes. The questions asked are an evaluation and an expectation across the system and within schools. Particular emphasis and energy was placed in seeking voices and experiences from marginalized communities and groups, especially as it informs their work of supporting schools and advocating for families. And lastly, they support the language such as interrupt and disparity being used in the policy. And from a PTA member, a quote that was mentioned and stated in our reflection in our feedback session is, setting the culture of the school and school community with this policy can go a long way towards improving the disparities that exist and help parents and community members think about how their actions and biases impact the school. Before we leave Section B, the Superintendent's Teacher Advisory Committee did identify key areas that would support them in applying an equity lens, particularly with questions 6 through 10. They noted the need for professional learning, curriculum resources. They cited the continuation of resources such as EL and the resources that will center equity, backgrounds, and culture, again, as evidenced in the Teacher Evaluation Standard 2. Time for planning and engaging in authentic and reflective conversations, establishing equity teams at their school to guide the work, and finally, accountability for this work at both the school and the district level. And then finally, Section C, our commitments to equity section. General themes were, again, across all of the groups that we were able to get feedback from. There was an appreciation that equity extends and expands to all areas of the organization. Stakeholders discussed key areas of strength and stated commitments, and they saw alignment and impact to their work and service to students. It was great to see how each group was able to align to many of the different commitments found in Section C. And again, a teacher from the Superintendent's Teacher Advisory Committee noted that this policy does a good job recognizing the board's needs of ensuring equity, but outlining specific actions and beliefs that teachers and staff can work towards. Stakeholder involvement is key for success to recognize the importance of education. All right, now we'll take a moment, a few minutes there, and we have representatives from each of those stakeholder groups that provided feedback. We have to my left Dr. Teresa Caswell, who is a principal of our district, and she is serving as the co-chair of the Division of Principals and Assistant Principals Equity Committee. We have Teresa Jones, who is a parent here in our district and president of the Wake County Parent Teacher Association. Jody Damryer, who is a counselor here in our district. Christina Gordon, who is a parent and an educator in our district. And Aaron Nong, a Wake County Public School System student, senior scholar. Each will provide you with about a 2 to 3 minute reflection on the impact of the equity policy to their respective roles. And we will start with Dr. Caswell.
Excuse me. Thank you, Dr. Chavis. Good afternoon, board members, Superintendent Moore, and thank you so much for the opportunity to speak as a Wake County Public School System principal and co-leader of the Division of Principal and Assistant Principals Equity Committee. I am very excited for a potential district-wide equity policy, which will provide principals and assistant principals specific language and guiding questions to support students within their school community. Questions 1 through 5, for example, provide an equity lens for us to use when creating, implementing, and deciding on the systems and structures that guide our day-to-day work as principals. Moreover, questions 6 through 10 would provide a guide for school staffs to consider their own identity, the identity of others, both of which may strengthen relationships with students, resulting in more effective instruction and data analysis. We know from the research that understanding and honoring students for who they are results in the greater trust of and engagement in school. This policy ensures that all Wake County staff will have the same language to consider their beliefs, strengthen their understanding of others, and be supported in the process by their school leaders. When looking at the 11 points at the end of the policy on what we endeavor to accomplish as a district community, I would like to pay special attention to how the adoption of this policy may impact number 6, recruiting and retaining racially and linguistically diverse and culturally competent administrative, instructional, and support personnel. One of the problems of practice identified by the Division Equity Committee members focuses on finding, recruiting, and retaining racially and linguistically diverse staff. We know that students experience more success in school when they have at least one teacher who reflects their racial identity. This success begins growing exponentially when they have multiple K-12 teachers who look like them. It is my firm belief that an adopted equity policy will encourage more diverse applicants as they see that they are not only valued and supported, but that all staff are expected to stretch and grow their identity beliefs as well. The resultant collective efficacy within schools and the district will support student belonging and, by extension, the narrowing of opportunity gaps and disparities in achievement. Thank you so much for investing your time and support in this important work.
All right, we'll hear from Ms. Jones next.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank you as well for taking this important step to making equity in our schools a policy. I was at the Color of Education conference over the weekend, and Dr. Anthony Graham made an excellent point when he said that programs and initiatives come and go with the people that create them, but policies remain. I'd also like to thank Dr. Chavis for trusting me to work with him on this feedback process. I've been a member of PTAs in Wake County for 14 years. I strongly believe in parent advocacy and that the school-family partnership is essential to a quality education. But in order to bring all stakeholders to the table and build those relationships, we must address PTA fundraising. I don't believe this deeply embedded system will change until the county holds school leadership accountable and the school leadership changes their expectations of PTAs. As the largest and oldest child advocacy group in the country, PTA has been responsible for many programs and legislative actions that have helped to improve the lives of children, from the creation of kindergarten classes to hot and healthy lunches. But I believe many PTAs have lost their way and have primarily become fundraising organizations, further increasing the disparity among schools in our district. Well-meaning parents have raised tens of thousands of dollars to provide anything from clubs to new playground equipment. It has become an expectation from school administration that PTAs will provide this supplemental funding. To raise the most amount of money possible, PTAs often use fundraising models that reward high earners with prizes and recognition, leaving out our most vulnerable students. Despite the number of times this has been covered in training by the council, without guidance from the district, parents are unlikely to rein in this type of fundraising. Because everyone wants their school to offer the best for their students, but they are not providing the best for all students. I understand that it is unrealistic to think that the equity policy will dramatically change this paradigm in our community, but I think it is an important start. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Jody Damrauer. I'm a school counselor, and in my role, we are huge advocates for equity, and we need the support of policy behind us, and we need to know that we are supported by policy. The issues that we're facing in our schools are happening now, and to have a policy that provides a guide and a framework would not only promote collaboration, but it starts this foundation, clear expectations for ourselves and our colleagues, a common language that we don't currently have, goals and ideals, and it also starts to send the message that there's a sense of urgency here that we need to pay attention to. The ideas outlined in the policy also just establish a healthy process for problem solving around what we see in our schools, and it should be part of our regular practice, but it's not. So we need it. Having this common language and having a framework will help guide school counselors like myself who are currently doing this work to be able to collaborate, be able to talk to colleagues, to be able to bounce ideas, to break down our data in groups, and have those conversations across our PLCs as well. Our goal is to create a fair and inclusive environment for all our students, but it really does start with policy, and we need this framework to get the other steps rolling and to feel supported and know that we are supported. And it was very empowering to see the draft in front of me, so I appreciate that. Thank you.
Good afternoon, board members and Superintendent Moore. I sit before you not only as a Wake County Public School parent and educator, but also as the National Educators Association Professional Practice and Policy Teaching Fellow, a product of Wake County Public School System, and the granddaughter of a retired Wake County Public School educator and an administrator. My background is particularly relevant because among all of these titles and roles, I know what it means to be a student of color in Wake County Public School System. I am thankful for the opportunity to give feedback on the drafted proposal for equity work here in our district. The impact of this policy implementation is best described in my own experience with being an educator in the more affluent part of our district. And then, when my husband and I made the decision to move our 3 sons to our base schools in Southeast Raleigh. No racial equity training or professional development could prepare me for the vast difference I would see firsthand as a parent between 2 schools in the same district, only separated by roughly 20 miles. Differences in resources, hiring practices, family and community partnerships, and even our playgrounds, to name just a few, are examples of how equity work needs to be at the foundation of all that we do for all children in Wake. In my time as an educator in Wake County Public Schools, it is extremely apparent that the true work of equity shows up in schools in silos. I have experienced leadership whose mission was to transform our school with equity work. She served as a lead learner in the work for her staff, and she cultivated a culture of change for staff and students. It was a dedication that was contagious. Unfortunately, I have also experienced and witnessed leadership where parents are not seen as partners in this work. Punitive discipline measures are implemented for students, and the top-down approach to leadership was the culture. As I speak before you as a representative of all educators in our district, the commitment to a culture change here in Wake County Public Schools and training, ongoing professional development, and check-ins should be for all stakeholders, including leadership and this board. The most striking detail from the proposal is in Section A, under the definition of equity as described as an action. This bears weight of importance because equity work is not merely jargon we can use to attract parents or something we can place on paper to add to our prestigious name. Working towards equity in Wake County Public School System involves operational actions that ensure equally high outcomes for all participants in our system, removing structurally influenced predictability of success or failures. As a parent and educator, I believe change must happen from the inside out, and that this work must be seen as actionable, dynamic, and ongoing. While a policy is an important first step, it must be followed by a multi-action process, strategic plans, time-bound, measurable, and must be followed by measurable deliverables, ongoing evaluation, and transparent external communications with the community, and demonstrate ongoing commitment. The board and all in leadership at each level must also make a commitment to this work and have transparent and communicated mechanisms for accountability. The work of making progress toward equity and justice is never ending and will not be solved with a policy alone, but actions from all that support it. Thank you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor and a privilege to speak before you today in representing my fellow students. My name is Aaron Nung, and I'm a senior on the equity team at Sanderson High School. And when Dr. Chavis asked me to share a little bit about what this policy would mean for me as well as the student body, I was beyond thrilled because there's a lot to be excited about. What really stuck out to me about this definition, and what I perhaps most appreciated, was the empowerment-centric language, because oftentimes implementing equity can be seen as just simply implementing a series of policies and we just expect the results to trickle down. But removing physical barriers to access is only half the battle, because we need our students to believe in themselves. And speaking with other members of the Sanderson Equity team, it really hurt my heart to hear that these students who felt as though they were ready to handle advanced coursework or pursue an extracurricular activity were being discouraged not by the school, but by their own peers, because there was this assumption that this class would be too much work or that this extracurricular just wasn't meant for them. And it revealed to me that we've inadvertently created this culture where students believe they have limits placed on them by their circumstances, and these students have internalized these expectations. So when I see that the county is equipping me and removing barriers to help me reach my unbounded potential, it feels as though my school is personally invested in my success. And if I know my teachers, staff, and leaders believe in me, then I feel motivated to challenge myself in spite of whatever circumstances I find myself in. And I wish to point out this word, predictability, because unfortunately we do see trends among certain demographics, and this results in us assigning different expectations to different groups. And if this is the feedback we're giving our students, telling them even implicitly that we believe they are only capable to an extent because of resources they may or may not have, because of obligations outside of school, or because factors outside of their control, we are only setting ourselves up for a self-fulfilling prophecy. Which is why we want to not only eliminate these disproportionalities, but we want to eliminate the culture that encourages them. And looking at this proposed policy through this equity lens, it's crucial to uplift these students, to reflect and ask ourselves, in what ways are these practices limiting? In what ways are we empowering our students? In what ways are we concerned with their success? And in what ways have our own biases shaped the way we view them? With these questions guiding our commitment to equity, helping us allot different resources based on differing needs, helping us to ensure equal access to see an equal outcome, we are enabling our students to succeed, to reach their unbounded potential. You know, I've been in Wake County all my life, and as a senior, I'm on my way out. But when I imagine a future with this policy as the framework, I can only dream of the grand feats the next generations will achieve. And not just one demographic or another, no, everyone. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you. I want to thank this team of educators, a student, and a parent for raising and lifting your voice today. Such powerful words that you provided today. We're nearing the end of the presentation today. I wanted to give some time to just some final additional thoughts and questions that were raised from each of the stakeholder groups. And you'll see this on the next slide. Accountability, how are we holding ourselves accountable as a district once this policy is enacted, and it's what we live and do our work, the lens through which we do our work. What are the accountability measures? What will be the metrics and measures that we'll look at to ensure that we are making progress towards goals? In some of the meetings, especially those, our student meeting and one of our community group meetings, it might be necessary for us to define terminology such as predictability or disparity. And then finally, how do we operationalize the policy? What does it look like across the system in schools and at the individual level? So here, this is what I present to you and lift up, is that we have a great opportunity to include these critical areas in our strategic plan, specifically as we unpack and socialize our work within the essential pillar of equity-focused practices. And this can also be included in supporting documents and/or our MP. So with that being said, we want to open the floor for any questions and comments that you have from the board and ask that you decide today your next steps of taking this as a first read to the November 1st meeting. Chair Kushner.
Thank you, Dr. Chavis. And I'm going to ask if you could, or Dr. Crane, if y'all could send the names of those of you. I didn't catch all the names of your wonderful panel. It's on this slide. Thank you. I need to keep up with y'all. Thank you. I will go back to that slide. So just want to thank you all for being here and from speaking from your perspective on the importance of this policy. It means a great deal for you all to be here today. And thank you for the work you've already given Dr. Chavis and Dr. Crane in giving that feedback. So with that, I will open it up to my colleagues for questions. Ms. Scott.
Madam Chair, I have some questions about the proposed changes. Is this an appropriate time to discuss those? As I looked over some of the language in blue, so if we're looking at the policy itself, I was a little disappointed to see changes to in section B, particularly after listening to the feedback from the stakeholders that are sitting before us. Was disappointed to see beliefs and actions and progress towards equity also requires an application of an equity lens into individual beliefs and actions, that was changed to practice and changed throughout that sentence. And then also leading into number 6, how might my own practice limit opportunities? And that was changed to that, where it originally said, how might my own beliefs and practices disrupt opportunities for all students to learn, grow, and succeed. And my concern with changing that language is that it takes a layer or a level of responsibility off individuals who are working with our students and working in our school system of not examining their implicit bias. Because to me, it reads, maybe someone has biases, but they just won't say that at school. Or I promise I won't take that with me into the classroom. Perhaps anti-LGBTQ thoughts, racist thoughts that occur with an implicit bias when people do training and realize what biases they have. I think it's important to offer an opportunity, to offer a pathway that encourages people to make that self-examination. And I worry that changing that language takes that level of responsibility off of the individual to truly examine, do my implicit biases impact the work I do with students, children, and everyone inside of our schools?
Thank you, Ms. Scott. Dr. Chavis, are you able to address
Yes.
some of that
Yes,
revision?
thank you for that, Ms. Scott. We do appreciate that. In getting and collecting feedback, we wanted to make sure when we had the word beliefs written in the policy that we weren't asking people to get, we weren't explicit enough about saying beliefs about student abilities, student outcomes, and their performance. And so the question came about, are we talking about my religious beliefs, my belief in my faith, right? And so we didn't want people to have to necessarily drop those things, but be more centered on, their actions, their biases. And so we put practices there as a combination of what your beliefs are about student performance and their outcomes, abilities, so on and so forth. And then what are the actions that comes about? And so the practices kind of contains both of that notion of students, what we believe in their work, and then the actions that go into, like what is the impact now of what my beliefs are in the practice of my daily operations as an educator. And then I wanted to also look at question number 6. I know there's been change. So you'll see practice representing beliefs and actions 3 times. That was changed there. Number 6, when we went back as staff just to review the original language there, how might my own beliefs and practices disrupt opportunities for all students to learn, grow, and succeed? It just didn't make sense there to use the terminology disrupt as we're talking about individuals and then opportunities. So we went back to change that to make sure that was, it made sense, and it provided an opportunity to look and provide an opportunity, again, of self-awareness, self-reflection as to who I am, my practice, my beliefs, and my actions, beliefs about students and their abilities, my actions based on those beliefs. How does my own practice then limit opportunities? And then you'll see the parallel language, learn, grow, and succeed, that we already have in the strategic plan.
And if it's may I appreciate that. I'd still worry that taking out biases and beliefs, I think that's something we all have to examine is, does my belief as a white, cisgender, Catholic woman potentially have a negative impact on a student? I think it's something that's something I need to constantly examine and question to be the best educator or be the best board member or community member that I can be. So I understand that. I appreciate the thoughtfulness. I appreciate that we're striving for inclusivity here, but I worry that taking that strong language out weakens the message. And that's just me talking personally, but I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that feedback, Ms. Scott. That's Mr. Hegarty, then Ms. Mahaffey, and then Ms. Carter.
Thank you.
Well, this is difficult because I believe that I truly understand where Ms. Scott is coming from.
with her comments, but quite honestly, I don't think that I could disagree any stronger. I think that the removal of that language to the policy is essential to the success of having a workable policy. I truly do, because I believe you cannot dictate belief. We can honestly and openly evaluate practice. We can see practice. We can look at practice objectively. But when we try to say that we know the hearts of someone, we know the beliefs of someone, well then, who is making that judgment? What is in their heart? What is their implicit bias? I think we can use our metrics to measure practice. We can see the outcomes of practice. I think when we talk about belief, I really do believe we get into a slippery slope. You know, this is where, well, I'll stop with that. I did want to note the change and thank you for the change for the reasons so stated. Where we have a policy and a policy is put in place, you know, a policy is to be followed. And where we create expectations, then it's expected that we enforce expectations. You know, I'm firmly committed to the development and the passage of an equity policy. And again, I want to make clear from the past meetings, I truly appreciate the work and what's gone into the policy and its evolution so far. You know, I still think there are potential problems that I will bring to you, but I understand they may not be addressed in a day. None of this is the work that can be addressed in a day. Some of my concerns, as I've brought up, as I've mentioned before, deal with the questions dealing with the equity lens and going through such a specific and rigorous inquiry versus a more broader, comprehensive equity. And I would note in the first questions, in the beginning of B, I think we really make a point, it seems intentional, that we're talking about marginalized groups. And I believe that's the heart of our work. But then when I see the questions in the second part of B, I'm seeing more language about all students. And I just wonder how in practice this will be used. For example, we've talked about, you know, when we look at questions 8, questions 10, question 6, could a parent come to us and question whether, you know, a teacher or administrator's practices have limited their students' opportunity to learn, grow, and succeed, marginalized or not marginalized, perhaps in access to higher level classes that might not be offered at a school, in terms of funding for special programs or languages that might be important to their culture. You know, when we go further down, you know, objecting we look at how do I center and affirm their lived experiences, culture, and identities. Is religion part of culture? And does this create now an inquiry where, you know, certain practices in the classroom that might be objectionable to someone for religious reasons may be objected to, outside of our work trying to correct disparities that have historically marginalized many of our students? So I know all of these may not be able to be fixed. I don't have a perfect solution to it. But in trying to cover everything and be as broad as possible, I really do have genuine and sincere concerns that the policy may be able to be used in situations that perhaps it was not intended for. And so I guess my question, given that context, is when you talk about accountability, how do you see students, parents, and others being able to bring this policy up to the board in terms of grievance, complaint, 504 meeting process, if they feel any of these opportunities are not offered to all students?
Will, if I could just jump in, I just want to point out that I get where you're coming from in terms of how that language fits in this part of the policy, but that this part of policy is about a reflection that a staff member engages in. So I don't know if that's maybe where there's a potential disconnect in how we would ask a staff member to engage in a reflection, and then how that shows up in policy. So I don't think that it's, but I understand how policy language is used when folks want to bring a concern or talk about how something may or may not be happening in the classroom. But the intent of the language is for the staff member to engage in reflection of that. And so I think maybe it's not your typical policy language.
Yes, Mr. Blumberg, I know you added that. I know we added that last paragraph. If you could highlight.
Yeah, I just
perhaps
wanted to
gets
note
to
that
Mr. Haggerty's point.
I certainly understand, because the board does have to address a number of complaints as sort of a judicial body for appeals, and would want to make sure that there was clarity about that with respect to this policy. But I would point out the last paragraph that does make it clear that this policy is not designed to form the basis of any grievance under policy.
And we have had some feedback to remove that paragraph, but I think given Mr. Haggerty's concerns, that's why it was added.
Okay.
Mr. Haggerty, do you have other?
Thank you. No, I
issues?
appreciate the superintendent's comments and Attorney Blumberg's comments. If you hear where I'm coming from, if you have any thoughts on how to address it or how to ensure that this truly is used to help our historically marginalized students, the students with the most need, I'd appreciate any feedback. And if that's a conversation for another time, I respect that. Thank you.
I know we have talked through, part of the presentation today was like next steps. How do we operationalize this policy? And so I think a key aspect to this is then what does the supporting documents, what does RMP look like if that's the route we want to go? What does it look like in the strategic plan? I think it's important for us to be explicit that these are reflective questions for teachers, particularly for the students outlined in the equity policy, in both the definition and in Part B, where we're talking about historical disparities. I think we can emphasize that and provide that support. That can be a central part of our training here at the district level. So I think that's a really good place for us to do that as it aligns to those questions.
Thank you.
Ms. Mahaffey and then Ms. Carter.
Thank you so much. First, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here today and sharing your perspectives, and I understand why you made Aaron the closer. And thank you. It's always great to hear from our students. And, you know, I appreciate many of the changes. I like that we added inclusive before environment. I think inclusivity is a really important piece, because inclusivity and acceptance is the goal of this policy. And adding student outcomes there as well. I appreciate the clarification on number 6 and how that feeds into 7, 8, 9, and 10, and getting that feedback from other stakeholder groups. As just a quick, number 8 reads, how do I recognize and make use of the gifts, talents, and skill sets that each of my students possesses? So I think we can, Dr. Crane, you're already on it? Yep, I saw the wince. I did. And Dr. Chavis, you said my next questions were, what does this look like? You know, do we need RMP? How does this go into and fit under the new strategic plan framework? And the stakeholders in their questions of what does this look like operationalized. So those were my follow-up questions for right now. So I guess I will be done for the moment.
Thank you, Ms. Mahaffey. Ms. Carter, and then Dr. Martin.
Right, and I echo, thank y'all for being here, and it was important to hear from you all. Really appreciate y'all taking your time. And I wanted to thank you for some of the language that was changed. I know I had brought up disrupt back in after our meeting in September, and I do want to follow up with my other one that I brought up in our meeting in September, our one-on-one, was interrupt. And I do think I was looking at some of the language the first time it's mentioned, and it's a sentence with, we hold ourselves accountable to practices that will, it's under Section B, sorry. And to me, eliminate would fit there. It aligns with core belief number 2, eliminating the ability to predict, and it lists the similar things. And I would just like to once again mention my preference in that. I'm not trying to, in all honesty, I think it's a stronger term to eliminate or end or stop or discontinue. I yield to Dr. Crane on that, but I know when we had our small meeting in September, those were the two things. I had brought up other things, but that were mentioned, and I just would still like, I don't know, I just feel like it's something that we could use and still have a strong policy, if not in some ways a little stronger and linked with language that is already in our core belief number 2.
And just to be clear, so Ms. Carter, are you talking about that second paragraph
Yeah.
under B?
Section B.
We will hold ourselves accountable to practices that eliminate the predictive association? Is that what you're suggesting?
And it's mentioned actually in, sorry, I'm trying to scroll down at the
It
same time.
does mirror the
And it's-
strategic plan.
Yeah, and we mentioned eliminate and other, number 8 under, I just think it's a word, eliminate, to me is a clearer word. It's end, interrupt, it can come back. And I hope that's not what we're wanting, so.
Dr. Chavis, had you considered
Is
that change? And can you give us some
Yeah, a
thoughts?
few things there. In getting feedback from different stakeholder groups, it was clear that the term interruption, and I think I mentioned it in one of the slides, that groups wanted to keep that language in the policy. And when thinking about that and teasing that out a little bit more, interruption is more of an immediate action as opposed to eliminate. While we hold ourselves to elimination of the outcome for our work, we know that's long term. An immediate action of interruption means we're going to do, I think Ms. Gordon mentioned it earlier, looking inside and outside, right? We're looking at our inside, our work, our implicit biases, our beliefs. We're doing that work in the inside, and then we're working towards, like, what does that mean with the people in front of us, our students, our school community. And so the use of the word interruption provides that language and that ability to do things not in a long-term way, but how can we do that immediately? Also, it's language that we have socialized as a district with our professional learning. I met with some principals about a month ago, and we did, intersection of behavioral health and equity. And we presented the culturally responsive framework again, where it's see inequity, understand it, and interrupt it. So interruption doesn't have to have a negative connotation. Again, it's the looking inside, calling out of self, and working with others in the community to try to build your understanding of different cultures and backgrounds and perspectives. It's how we critique things. It's how we show empathy. So, when we think about the word interruption, it sounds negative in the sense that we've come to know what the word interruption is. But in what we do with professional learning and how we socialized it throughout our district, it's more about immediate action of how we don't get to a place where we have multiple things that we could have interrupted but become even larger issues. So
I'm going to seek some compromise because I respect the feedback from Ms. Carter. And given that second paragraph under Part B is aspirational, and using eliminate in that instead of interrupt in that paragraph, I think would be aspirational and reflects our strategic plan, whereas keeping interrupt in the questions keeps it as what you're thoughtfully reflecting on, Dr. Chavis, as the language that we use in practice. And I'm hoping Ms. Carter will see that as a win-win, to keep interrupt in the analysis and the sort of self-reflection of the questions, which I understand is important for practice. But if we use eliminate in that aspirational second paragraph, I'm going to suggest that to my colleagues. Is there any objection to doing that?
I understand and respect that. I raised the same issue that I have with it in the strategic plan language, particularly with respect to socioeconomic status, because poverty has implications that unfortunately, you can't eliminate. And, I mean, we want to interrupt the impact of poverty on education, but if a child is malnourished in the first 3 years of life, that is going to be predictive throughout their life. We can say it's aspirational to eliminate it. It's neurologically impossible. So that's where I like the interruption better. Eliminate absolutely works for the other two. It just doesn't really work. But again, I raised that for the strategic plan. It is a concern. Given the language in the strategic plan, I obviously won't object to it here, but I do raise that concern.
Thank you. I'm just trying to, get to consensus and to have some, to get all of our community voices heard. Ms. Johnson-Hostler. But thank you, Dr. Martin.
Yes. So, I mean, I'm not going to hold this policy up, but we had this discussion about this word at the last policy committee meeting, and I still feel the same sense of urgency. Interrupt is like the word urgency. And the truth is, we are not going to eliminate our practices, our beliefs, or our biases. We're human beings, and we're always evolving. We're just evolutionary. Interrupt just means, as a part of your practice, you are in tune to who you are and how you show up. Because we're all whole people. You cannot leave part of who you are. I do a job that requires people to center the survivor. I know people come to work as whole people, and I encourage that. The practice that you're asking when you're saying center the equity lens is about all of us, regardless of who we are. I'm a Black, cisgendered, Baptist, church-going woman. I bring my whole self to this table. However, I don't take those things into meeting the needs of other people, and it is a constant practice. You have to be willing to interrupt it for yourself. That language isn't about somebody else interrupting it for you. It is about a personal practice, which is why you've sold me on practice. I certainly liked, I was with Ms. Scott last policy meeting. I wanted to leave those words there because I also, again, we realize and have acknowledged that this is not a policy like other policies. This is a policy that we're saying, here is who we want to be. The entire policy is aspirational. And I have to say, a part of my aspirations every day getting up is that I can interrupt the things that will prevent me from doing what's right by people. Because we're human. None of us can operate in this world and say that our personal beliefs don't change and challenge how we respond to people who are different. That's a hard truth for people, and of course, I'm always going to repeat the truth. It doesn't mean we're not capable. It doesn't mean that we're not. We can still be empathetic, but we're human, and the equity lens challenges us to challenge our own humanity in the way that we show up for other people. And so I'm not going to hold the policy up, but as you can see, I feel very passionate that it is our job to acknowledge that this is a personal call out. This isn't about Dr. Chavis calling out our district around an equity lens. This policy is saying, we are giving you this, each person. How do you internalize a lens? It is literally a lens to frame how you see the world. It's like people say rose-colored glasses. These are the best rose-colored glasses this board could come up with in a compromise. And I'm willing to sit at this table and continue to compromise, but I'm also going to still publicly say that the aspiration for me is that people join each of us daily to interrupt practices that harm people. And I'm not going to apologize for a word that feels hard for people, because this is hard. If it wasn't hard, we wouldn't still be talking about it in 2022. No one wants to determine the predictability or outcome because of a kid's circumstances. Not one human being, I don't believe, ever thought in this generation thought that that's what they go to school to do. I believe people believe they're doing the right thing. This is saying the right thing isn't enough, right? Your heart isn't enough. You have to put your head and intellectually consider how you do this work. That's what interrupt means to me. And that was the goal of socializing the word interrupt, is to acknowledge the need for urgency for each person to acknowledge how we show up in this world for other people. It shouldn't be a negative connotation. And, I will challenge us, even if we use the word elimination, because I will do what we need to do to move the policy, but I still will challenge each of us in our daily practices to think about and how any instant, doesn't matter, grocery store, these things are happening to all of us daily. And if we're not conscious of the interruption, that is how we harm other people unknowingly. And as you all know in my work, we say silence is not condoning something.
Yes,
Silence
absolutely.
is condoning it, and I can't be silent and say elimination is an end-all be-all, because we can agree people want to eliminate this. I don't care who the person is. People can agree on eliminate. It's an easier word, because none of us really believe we're going to get to it in our lifetime, because we haven't yet. And that's not being pessimistic. It's the truth. So optimism is that we will do the practices. Again, I won't hold it up, but I do feel strongly about the word.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson also. Yeah, Superintendent
I'm just
Moore.
going to add on to the end of Ms. Johnson-Hostler's statement there, that I think there's some intentionality where interrupt is used to really focus on equity as an action versus an outcome. And I think that, we've used eliminate in our core belief. We use eliminate in this policy in an earlier section. I think the places where interrupt shows up, it is intentional because of the portion of this equity lens definition of equity with equity as an action also. And because I think interruption is more of an action verb than eliminate being more aspirational and long-term. So.
Thank you, Ms. Moore. And I appreciate, Ms. Johnson-Hostler, that for your thoughtful feedback. I appreciate that. Dr. Martin, I
think Ms. Waters might have a comment related
Ms.
to
Waters
this.
and Ms. Cash, and then Ms. Waters. Sorry, I think I saw Ms. Cash's hand first, and Ms. Waters.
No, I have other questions. I thought there was more discussion on this particular topic.
Okay, Ms. Waters, if you. I wanted to address this specific. I apologize. Thank you.
Well,
Thank you, Ms.
thank you,
Cash.
and everything that Ms. Johnson-Hostler said. And really thinking about the word interrupt and the ability to take immediate action is very important, I think, in this policy. And it's also not wanting to hold up this policy. I know there was a desire to see compromise around Ms. Carter's comments, but I'm probably several comments too late in backing up Ms. Scott's sort of initial beliefs about some of the other language with the beliefs and actions. I see it just the same that you do. The language here with practice, for me, doesn't address or speak or call out the things that we need to do to be ensured that we are actually looking at our implicit biases. So I'm late in making that comment, but, if we looked at a way to kind of compromise the language with Ms. Carter, maybe there was dialogue around other ways to look at the word practice. In other words, that could, at least for me as someone reading this policy and someone who lives as a Black woman in America, picking up the policy and reading that sentence with practice, it doesn't resonate with me as an actual call to action and a way to examine, because people have practices that they don't see anything wrong with. But when you challenge someone to look at their beliefs and their actions, then that takes a different level of energy to stop and think, well, maybe I do have a belief or my actions are actually causing harm. But when it's, for me, practice, that word doesn't do enough for me, as Ms. Carter was saying. But I don't want to hold up the policy in terms of the work, but wanting to kind of look at, as we looked at compromise for other language, looking at ways to ensure that we are really hitting the mark on what we want people to look at individually as we think about generation after generation experiencing the predictability of their lives based upon these factors, and finally being in a place to have a policy. I just want to get that language right and just really thank Ms. Scott for that strong desire to see that language. And like I said, I'm several comments probably too late, but just needed to process and think about what that meant. But that's where I sort of see, as we look at ways to compromise and get a policy that really does help us to, one, normalize the conversation around equity, and then be able to operationalize and really make the impact to interrupt the challenges that our students are facing. So thank you.
Thank you. I think your timing's perfect. Ms. Cash, and then Dr. Martin, I cut you off, I'm afraid. So go ahead.
Well, we were on the one topic. I thought we needed to finish that before we go other places.
Yes.
So I'm surprised, because Dr. Chavis and I spent a lot of time on this conversation, so I don't see it in here. But so although I might probably, likely support this policy, I thought the policy was about inclusiveness and about marginalized people. And I really feel like I was okay up until we got down to the point of the commitment to equity. And at this place is where we start to begin to name all the marginalized people, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic, or language of origin, and so forth. But we're not naming the disengaged children that we are facing right now. And I feel very strongly about having this in the policy. And I know we don't have any historical perspectives or any type of advocacy group for them or any predictable data, but they're in our schools, and these are our students that are quiet, and we don't recognize them, we don't see them until something happens. And I don't know the terminology for it. I know we don't really they don't recognize who they are, but they actually don't think they are anybody in our schools. They actually believe they're invisible. And so if we're going to start in this naming of commitment to equity, I would like to somehow include the children that are hurting really bad, that are marginalized in our community and are doing the things that we worry most about in our schools, because they're not engaged in anything. And I know that's probably not part of historical data, but they're in our schools, and I think we're better than historical data. And I would be really disappointed if we didn't at least address them. And I know that, Dr. Chavis, you mentioned the fact that including but not limited to was a possibility, but I believe they deserve more than that language, more than an et cetera. And I go back to even the bullying. I'm sorry. Were you? Oh.
No, I just wanted to say something.
The bullying policy goes through all of them again, and they're not mentioned in there at all. These marginalized, disengaged students that don't fit into any category, but are the ones that we're seeing in the hospitals the most. They're the ones that are doing the things we read in the news. And we look later and see, did we just miss these kids? I would be disappointed if we didn't mention them in this policy.
I do see, just to be clear, I see equity.
You see them?
I see equity as the definition of inclusion, because I think, to me, and fairness.
I think it does mean inclusion, but then we start to list everything under the commitment.
Yeah, we don't have a category for that.
Student outcomes was added, but maybe someone else can, Ms. Scott, perhaps you have.
It's the first paragraph under commitment to equity that I have a problem with.
Okay.
I don't know how that could be added, but I mean, just disengaged students is a topic that is often discussed in the education world. While we were, looking at historically marginalized people, I think it would be appropriate to find a way to add that, because that's certainly what our teachers strive to do, I would think.
Happy.
I hear you, Ms. Cash, and I know we had this conversation, and I think as we look at what has been carried out, a lot of that hugs that federal policy, which is also part of what is in our bullying and harassment. I see that in the equity as an action is equipping every student with. And while we don't have an easy word to define those students, I don't feel like those students are specifically excluded, even though they're not specifically named in that policy. But I also hear you wanting them to be there. But I see this as an inclusive policy, and just because you don't see yourself in this policy doesn't list it specifically.
I know
don't
we're
think
hugging.
this excludes anyone.
I do know we're hugging adoption of other policies ahead of us, but we're better than that, because we're seeing these students right here now in our schools. And if we're going to start, we're naming a lot of students in that first paragraph. And if we are going to do that, I feel like we've left that group out.
This was a bit of a problem.
They are a part of inclusion, I agree, but all these are part of inclusion, but we're listing them.
This was a serious part of a problem in our bullying and harassment policy because we had the language, I think we took most of it out, that we don't support illegal bullying and harassment and then give the names of what meets the legal definition. If you look at it technically, that implies that there is some legal form of bullying that we do support, right? If we just don't support illegal, then that means if it's not illegal, we support it. So, I mean, I think that's the challenge that we have. I actually wonder, Ms. Cash, and I'm not saying we should do it, that if we even just stop the sentence before the list.
So I also want to note that in sharing the framework in the presentation, we do have student dispositions and well-being. I know a student mental health policy has been mentioned before. I wonder if we need to maybe revisit bullying and harassment at some point in order to get those folks that we aren't catching in that as we move forward as well.
I understand there might be a mental health. I'm actually on the board now, so, and there may be a future mental health. And yes, Dr. Martin, that could be an answer, because I feel like when you start listing everybody but leaving some out, we've got a problem there. That to me is where I feel like we're not concerned about them. I mean, I take that, I really feel passionate that we're not concerned about those. And if we don't put them in among all of these other groups, then how do we know that people are looking for that child that's disengaged?
Ms. Waters, did you have some, Ms. Carter, after Ms. Waters?
And Ms. Cash, I too have concern for our students who are disengaged. I think it is very important that we have ways to identify and connect with those students. For me, the equity policy, in my mind, is to really look at our historically marginalized communities and to be able to put energy and emphasis there. Because if we think about every particular group of students, then this list can grow and grow and grow, and then it becomes harder to see that we are being intentional about addressing areas where there are disparities, where there is historical data to support the needs, to triage their needs and track their needs. And so not to dismiss or diminish the need to look at our disengaged students. They are very, very important, and their needs are important. But for me, the equity policy should lead with students who are historically marginalized, in my mind.
Any other thoughts on Ms. Johnson-Hostler?
I echo Ms. Waters' sentiments, and I also hear, to Ms. Waters' point, we hear you, Ms. Cash, and I will say this here because it's one way to get it done is, I don't think it completely answers your question, but back to the place of compromise, which is always difficult, is I don't think we put the period and stop in this equity policy. I think we could keep the list here because for me, that is why I fought hard to get this equity policy to the table. I will fight equally as hard because I think you and I have talked about this. You're right. We are missing the mark on our kids who are disengaged because we often associate quiet with they don't need our energy and support. So again, back to these practices that we all show up with that we don't interrupt, is we just move on because that's just how life happens. I don't think there's anything that says we can't pull back at our mental health and bullying policy. In my opinion, there are a list of things that we have another month. I'm not above saying, let's get it done, especially to your point, especially after the last few weeks. There isn't a reason that we can't address not just the policies, but also, sorry, staff, the RMP. Because I also think there's something to be said about RMP is the guidance that speaks to those who are implementing this. That this board is saying, we need you to focus on our marginalized communities, and we also need you to acknowledge that we are missing kids in a grave way, too detrimentally missing kids that are disengaged. And some of them, it isn't even their disposition. They're just quiet, so they become invisible to us. So I hear you, but I also want you to hear me say, I'm happy to say to the chair, we don't even have to wait on policy. We can bring those policies back to our board before before the top of December. Because I do think that it is our job to interrupt the practices this board can interrupt the practices that it has to stop delaying policies when we are saying, this is how we show who we are. It's the one tool that the board does have, and it is our policies. We don't have a lot of tools, contrary to popular belief, but the board does have our policies, and that speaks to who we are.
Well, and I have a trouble with historically marginalized, which is good, and I understand that. I know that this equity policy is for historically marginalized. The fact is, though, I've been talking about this for 6 years, about bullying, and I worry. I just don't think I don't know where we're going to address these kids, because we really didn't do it in the bullying, and we're losing kids right and left in our schools because they're being bullied, and we are not taking care of them.
Can I offer, what if we put the word visibility at the beginning of irrespective, right? Because oftentimes even the racial and all these other things are often, we pretend they're not there. They're invisible. So, and I'm not, right, this is just thinking about words, but what if we said the opportunity to succeed irrespective of visibility, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status? Would that get just a tinge of it? And first paragraph under C, which is, I think, where Ms. Cash is pointing to. Am I right, Ms. Cash?
It's the first paragraph, yeah, because that wasn't in one of the drafts
This
at the
can be
beginning.
accomplished only by identifying and appropriately interrupting practices and policies that perpetuate opportunity gaps in order to provide all students with the opportunity to succeed, irrespective of, I'm suggesting possibly add visibility, then race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, et cetera. I feel like that could, again, I'm just throwing it out, right? That could address both this and a lot of these other factors. A lot of the problem is invisibility. We've allowed ourselves not to see, and therefore they became an issue.
I'm just trying to understand, if you add a group of children that are at risk, does that take away from the historical marginalized? Is that what you're saying, if we add a group?
Yes. Ms. Waters, please.
For me, as we continue to add and add and add, it diminishes the impact of those who need to be triaged and put up front because of their needs and their outcomes, generation after generation after generation, being able to tie their outcomes to their zip code, to their race, to their gender. For me, adding more does diminish the impact of the policy. That's just my perspective.
Because I think by definition, the historically marginalized students are the most likely to be disengaged from learning.
I'm disappointed in the board to take these children out of inclusiveness, because that's what I understand. This policy is developed based on something that's very important historically, and I will support it. But I'll be very open about my disappointment in this board with that. But that's just one board member.
Mm-hmm. Well, I appreciate your...
I'll just preface this before, because Julie Crane will just have a heart attack in just a minute. So I'm just going to try to get the tenor of sort of what I'm hearing from board members with regards to understanding that there's a group of students that need attention that are not specifically named in the policy. And really what it seems like the conversation is about is whether or not that group and those needs are best situated in this policy versus in a well-being or mental health type policy or a bullying and harassment policy in other places, because we can't even think of a term to use in this litany of terms that really captures what we're thinking about. So what the whispers I am getting are the extent to which we can bring some language and revisions or ideas and have a conversation perhaps as early as our next work session, because it is light right now, in order to do that there.
Well, with all due respect, I hope that happens, but I have been talking about this for 6 years on bullying.
And I understand, Ms. Cash, you have been stalwart in pushing back on bullying. And I just think, as Ms. Johnson-Hostler also, policy can go a long way. I think our bullying policy is clear. The social media, the toxic nature of the last 6 years, 5-6 years in particular, in our society has come to the schoolhouse door. All of society and community comes to the schoolhouse door. I don't think you mean to say that we do not take bullying seriously. I hope you do not think, and maybe it just landed on me the way, that policy, I think we have reflected on it. And it just shows, just like with this equity policy, that policy isn't a magic wand. We have got to reflect every day in our classrooms about bullying policy. And we are trying today to find some language for our shared culture, not only to keep on bullying, we should keep talking about it, but for today's policy to bring fairness and inclusion through an equity policy to the practice and culture of Wake County. And so I do understand your frustration, because you've been so thoughtful and sensitive to so many families who have come to you because they know you're going to listen, and I respect you for that. But I also hope that we can see the both and of the work that needs to be done, but also the limitations of policy when we have this toxic culture of bullying on social media that we can't control. Our teachers and educators can't control what's on TikTok and some of this awful stuff that's gone on social, that children are exposed to.
And I appreciate that, Ms. Kushner, and you and I have talked a lot about it, and you have been very supportive. I was just disappointed when I looked at the bullying policy, and it mimics exactly what's in the historically marginalized, because it lists out everybody, just like it does in this policy and our bullying policy. So we leave that group out of our bullying policy. And I never understand why we name everybody we're going to be careful about bullying, but okay, and you have been very
That is
supportive.
discrimination, so that's a legal definition, the discrimination. But I think bullying is, our anti-bullying is inclusive of zero tolerance of bullying on any realm. But that could be, I hope I'm not making assumptions, Superintendent Moore, that bullying is just a zero tolerance across the board. But Ms. Mahaffey, maybe you can say this better than me.
Well, I think that's why I was whispering in Superintendent Moore's, can we bring this bullying harassment so that we can have that separate conversation from the equity policy, because it is a both and there is urgency in our community, and there has been urgency in our community. And I hear Ms. Cash, many folks have been on this board asking for, pushing for, and policy is slow. But this is something where we can at least begin that conversation on how to address those students who may be disaffected. And I hope that folks from our student support services and our counseling team who are seeing these students in the building and addressing these students will be able to provide some feedback to that, because they're the folks that are dealing directly with the students that are disengaged. But I would like if we can go back to the equity policy, and so we can have that conversation. And that's the beauty of policy, is it can be amended and updated as we learn more and hear more from folks.
And Ms. Carter, I'd written your note. I'm sorry I didn't circle back to you. You had your hand up, and you may have forgotten already. But given my lateness, I apologize.
I have to address my issues.
We are a little over time. I do
I
see
still
that.
haven't addressed the issues that I was going to bring up.
Okay. And Dr. Martin, you've been patient. Mr. Blumberg, did you have something specific to this discussion? Okay. Thank you. Dr. Martin.
Yeah, and I recognize the time, I think, but that also...
This is important.
This is important. I think this is really important work, and I think we're doing some of that important work. and to Ms. Cash's issue, yeah, our bullying policies are decent, but we've been skittish because of the right that the bullying to appeal to what bullying policies do. And so we've always fallen back to that federal language of legal definition, and there's a lot of bullying that doesn't fit the legal definition, and I don't think our policies do address that as effectively as they need to. There's a lot from our discussion today. Mr. Haggerty, I appreciate your questions about the accountability, and that historically is why I've not been terribly in favor of this being a policy, even though it is absolutely critically important, because it's not a normal policy. It is, I think, reinforces your discussion reinforces why it is so central to our strategic plan. It's not an RNP. I don't like that paragraph at the end, but as long as it's policy, that paragraph has to be at the end. So, yeah. But where we are, I support this going forward with the policy. I want to thank all of you for speaking today, because I think that your input is very important. And I want to particularly call it Ms. Jones. Thank you from the PTA perspective. I think what you highlighted has been one of the glaring points of inequity that is, there's a lot of inequity that goes on in unconscious and hidden bias, but what you brought out is inequity that is absolutely blatant, and we ignore it anyway. So thank you for raising that. It's hard work. The school system can't require anything of the PTAs, but you're absolutely right that we've got to work in partnership. So I just want to highlight that with a great big thank you. It's a ton of work. One minor point, and this gets maybe back to Ms. Cash and Ms. Waters' concerns. I'm glad to take belief out of the language here, because that goes down the religious, I can't control your beliefs. I would be comfortable if on the top of page 2, right before 6, if we left biases in there, right, to reflect on individual practice and bias. And I think that might get a little bit at what you're going after without going down the belief road. So I would offer, I got a couple other issues, but I would offer that as potentially language. Can you say that one? So we're right above number 6. When we talk about reflecting on individual, it was struck out belief and bias, to say individual practice and bias, because bias is something that, I don't care what my beliefs are, we all have biases. We need to reflect on them and think about them. And I think that language doesn't go down. If it appears like we're trying to dictate belief, that's number one, not what we're trying to do. Even if we're saying reflect on your beliefs, right? We're not trying to control beliefs, but I think we can legitimately say, hey, pay attention to your biases. We admit we all have them. So I would offer that as potential language. I don't know where people would land on that.
I think that in that top of the page to leave in and bias. It's
number 6.
Still under.
Before number 6.
Right. Replace belief with practice, but leave and bias.
In number 6 or
Right above.
Right above it.
Where it says that negatively impacts student outcomes.
Read individual practice and bias. Right.
I could support that, but I also understand if we need to compromise in order to move this forward and
Exactly.
just keep it at practice. But I think bias is something that we all need to reflect on.
Understanding the time, and that Dr. Chavis does want an action.
So I don't know how we land on that. Go ahead.
I mean, yeah, I don't know if that's something you want to get a thumbs up or thumbs down for, but I do think.
Yeah, I think there's a few
biases-
places where as we wrap this conversation up, we need some consensus around a table and a show of thumbs on yes or no. So I think it might be best, Will, if we just go through each blue.
Well,
Yeah.
I was going to say, that was one point. I've got a couple other points I'd
Okay,
like to
go
make
ahead.
maybe before we go thumbs up. But
No, go ahead. You finish yours. You were talking. I have one change that was aligned with a different change. It's already been made.
so, not specific to the policy, but to our discussion. I do want to acknowledge, and again, huge thanks to all of you, but sometimes when we talk about policies that are of passionate importance to a lot of us, we come across as though we're selling it and everybody thinks this way. And I just want to acknowledge that we know that's not the case. Several of us on the board, I'm sure probably all of us, have gotten some feedback where people are opposed to this policy. So some of the community feedback, I think it's important that we acknowledge, does counter that. So like I say, 100% support what you all brought, but I think it's important to acknowledge that it's not unanimous community support. I've tried to listen, and I think that things that concern me the most from what I'm hearing in the opposition is that there seems to be a lot of language of perception that equity is really a zero sum. And I hear and want to respect as best I can, but I'm afraid sometimes that it's all about historically marginalized groups reinforces the zero sum mindset. I don't believe equity is a zero sum. I believe if we create an equitable environment, it's great. It's better for everybody. So I just raise that. I think we need to be really careful in our language, in the way we talk about things, because if what we talk about is perceived to be zero sum, that is going to create opposition to equity work. I don't want to do that. The second thing that I hear in the opposition is a concern that equity equals dilution, which I don't believe for a minute. And I do appreciate the strategic plan language that we've used, and you've always talked about it as well. And I think just we want to emphasize that equity and excellence go together. Equity is about excellence. And so, like I say, I want to acknowledge that those are the two primary things that I've heard. I think they both need to be countered because equity is not zero sum and equity does not in any way mean dilution. Equity needs to always be equated with excellence. And like I said, I think we're doing that in the strategic plan. I don't see language that needs to go here, but I just want to reflect on some of that critique that I have heard. And finally, I do want to raise again, I'm still not a big fan of the definition. And it's not because of everything that everybody said about what they like about the definition. I agree with those in principle. But it's partly linguistic, and it's partly, I think we miss some of the bigger picture. When I see equity as outcome, it sort of reminds me like saying learning is a grade. A grade is a reflection of the outcome of learning. The grade is not the learning. So I strongly believe that the outcome is really our assessment of are we paying attention to and working on equity. So that I don't like equity defined as an outcome, but an outcome is, if we don't see it in outcomes, then it ain't happening. So I really see it as the assessment rather than the definition. Similarly, I would argue that equity requires action. Equity isn't action. Actions that I do are absolutely necessary to bring about equity.
It's semantics.
But the action is not the equity. The action is necessary to achieve equity. So those are my concerns with the definition. I will once more offer what I think is a more encompassing definition, and I'll offer it and recognize that it's probably not going anywhere, but I want to offer it because I think it's important. I would like us to say something to the order of educational equity is a mindset that seeks to provide an environment in which each student can achieve their unbounded potential. To build an equitable education system, it is necessary to first see disparities and barriers that disproportionately avail or restrict access to opportunities to certain groups of students. It is then necessary to understand why those disparities and barriers exist and how they disproportionately impact different subgroups. Intentional actions must then be implemented to interrupt and break down barriers to opportunity. We will know if we have effectively seen, understood, and acted to increase equity in our education system by evaluating outcomes of educational achievement with respect to characteristics, including but not limited to race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, language of origin, disability, sex, gender, identity, and sexual orientation. I think it's important for us to define it. We need to see, we need to understand, then we need to act, and outcomes, not a definition, but I believe outcomes are sort of the assessment, does it work? So again, I want to offer that. Obviously, it's not going to prevent my support of this policy. I think it does need to go forward. I just wish the language made a little more sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. And Mr. Blumberg, did you have something to add?
I think it's somewhat of a tiny, under the equity lens, the second paragraph, second sentence, I think we need to once again bring home the association with student outcomes. It was added in the paragraph above where it says "and student outcomes." I think you all are so used to the word association that you ought to automatically know the predictive association between race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, but still logically it needs to be an association between this and that. And so it still should, again, in my opinion, say "and student outcomes."
So
They're
repeat the addition from the paragraph that's preceding it.
Yes. I think somebody that doesn't know Wake County Schools and
Okay.
picks it up, they would understand. They would want to. They'd ask that
All right.
question. So
I think to go back to, thank you, Mr. Blumberg, to Superintendent Moore's suggestion that we go through each of the blue changes, Dr. Chavis, and just get a thumbs up or thumbs down on that.
I think it was. I could be wrong.
ahead.
I think it was where there has been some disagreement to determine where the board is on it. Unless I'm wrong.
Well, there's like three or
Right.
four places.
That's what I thought. Okay. Cool.
So,
Yeah, the first change that we see is in the definition, including or adding inclusive in front of environment. That's in the last sentence. I think we had, well, is there a consensus?
no discussion there.
Okay, no discussion, all right. Then if we go to Part B, we see, I didn't hear discussion about the student outcomes in that first paragraph.
I guess there's been a suggestion we add that to the second
Yes.
paragraph.
End of the second paragraph.
Is there
Any concerns about that?
Concerns about that?
Okay, go.
Okay. At the end of page 1, where we say we start with progress towards equity, we have individual practice as opposed to what was originally there with beliefs and actions.
And I don't know if that needs to be paired with the next one where
And-
there was a
Yep.
potential additional change. So any concerns with leaving it as practice in that first statement, the bottom of page 1?
I think if the board, the majority wants to add the word biases, would it make sense to have that also be included in that sentence as well?
And I
So-
think that was the question, what do we say practice and biases?
I think that, I think that when Dr. Martin made
we
the
just say
proposal
practice?
to add bias to the second sentence of that section is because that section is specifically about reflection. And so leaving it as practice in the first one and adding bias in the second part of it because it is governed by the verb of reflection. That was the suggestion.
So I support practice only just because I don't see much difference between the bias and the belief. But, I mean, everybody has biases. A lot of people have biases against me, I can tell you that. And I like the word practice.
I think that's the occupational hazard of being on a school board, but, I'm just going to say.
But I would counter that because of that, it's important, I think, to suggest that people take that pause to reflect on, could my biases be negatively impacting my work with students?
So let's go sort of one word at a time. So let's go with the bottom of page 1, practice, and just can maybe have a thumbs up there. Anybody have a question with with accepting the staff blue as is? I guess would be the end of page 1, the very first one, an application of an equity lens to individual practice, period. No concerns about the staff recommendation there. Okay. Then the next one at the top of page 2. It's either going to be practice or practices and biases.
I would prefer practices and biases, but again, I'm not going to hold up this if the consensus is practice.
So I think maybe a thumbs up on practices and biases would be helpful to know whether or not we even need to go there. Thumbs up on practices and biases?
I was just, if I might, I was just going to say, looking at the definitions of bias, I think there's a substantial difference between the words bias and belief. From looking it up, sure. Prejudice in favor sorry, let me try again. I'm jumbling my words. Prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way considered to be unfair. And so if we look at that, as opposed to a belief or a principle or a thought someone has, I think that is a little more focused, when we're talking about preconceived judging of people or groups in a way that's considered to be unfair, that I can accept bias more than some of the problems that I had with belief and thought. So, I'm...
Okay.
Ms. Carter.
And to clarify, so biases would mean for all groups, because I know there's been discussion, so I just want that to be, okay.
Mm-hmm. So again, then it would be, and the top of page 2, reflect on individual practices and biases. One more time after those comments. Thumbs up, practices and biases. Okay. That will move forward then. And then
Number 6.
number 6.
So currently, we have how might my own practice limit opportunities. We change beliefs and practices to be practice, and change disrupt to be limit. Question number 6.
Number 6.
So the first one first, how might my own practice, that's replacing beliefs and practices.
So I've not heard specific change to this one. Okay. Anyone want to push for a change to this one? Okay, that one goes. All right, and then that's all we talked about. The other things were just.
Well, Ms. Carter,
All right.
Ms. Carter requested us to consider replacing interrupt with eliminate.
Okay.
In the second paragraph of B.
Yeah, so I was saying that was all that we had.
Yeah.
That's all that staff had proposed.
That's what staff had proposed. Yeah, no, I just thought we needed to address.
Okay.
I personally prefer leaving it as interrupt, but I think we need to give Ms. Carter the courtesy of consideration.
She said she's good. She's good.
All right, she's good.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
And all the other changes there, I didn't hear discussion about in section C, second paragraph. Superintendent will take active steps to address, and then later on in that statement, as they apply the equity lenses. And commitment number 11, we added, and minority business enterprise participation in construction contracts. I believe that was direct feedback from the board.
Okay.
I appreciate that in the part that addresses the superintendent's role, that is active steps. And I think that it that active piece shows that there will be a commitment from the superintendent for this to be continually operationalized across our district. So I appreciate that.
So I think then where we are as our next steps is that we've got really 2. One would be this comes to the board for first reading at the November 1st board meeting, and at the November 1st work session, we will bring back our bullying and harassment policy with perhaps some attention to suggested changes, at the very least discussion around where those changes might need to be, and we'll be looking at that right away.
We would typically have a vote to send this to first reading.
Yes, thank you. And I just have to say, I'm a policy wonk, that I love the messiness of democracy, and I think we just went through that. And I think it shows when we all say something we don't like and we like about the policy, and yet we are coming together because we know how important this is to our students. And we have heard from this wonderful panel about how important it is to our staff and to our parents as well as our students, and the student focus of it. is incredibly important. So I'm really grateful to every single one of you for being here, for showing up and doing this work today. Thank you.
Ms. Kushner, I also would like to say, and by the way, I applaud the work Mr. Brown has done at Sanderson with his equity team, so thank you very much. I missed last Fridays, but thank you for the work that you all are doing. But I also think, to your point, Ms. Kushner, this board, hopefully through struggling through something very difficult, and me and Ms. Cash having a lot of sidebar conversations, because at the end of the day, we all came to this board the first time with things that we wanted to see happen. And as I shared to Ms. Cash, I could not be returning in December with, and this was a priority for me when I came on this board, just as the bullying and harassment. And at the end of the day, I'm hoping that what our student saw, and he can share as his equity team, you're almost done, but you still got several months with us, that it is messy. And we're human, and I think that's the whole point that I'm making here, is that we don't actually, and those of you who were with me when I was chair, we don't actually have to say the exact same words on the page, but we have to be in the same book. And I think that's what we just did here. And again, I stick by, nobody at this table wants the outcomes that are happening for any of our students. We all want the best for our students. How we get there is the hard work, it's the messy work, and it's the work that most of us don't like to do publicly. But as I said to Ms. Cash, that's kind of our role. It's also our role to show our students, if no one else, that you can disagree with people and still have the exact same and common goal. I don't think me and Mrs. Cash goal are at all different, which is what I kept leaning over to say to her. They're not different, but what I see as a priority and what she sees as a priority aren't actually horribly different. We just had to have this really difficult conversation. And also, you have to be an ally when you can be. And I sit next to the superintendent, so I use my privilege to be like, hey, can we get this done? So I use my positional privilege sitting next to the superintendent, because you're right. We move very slowly. Now, the superintendent and the chair could have said no, but they're right here, so I thought I'd ask. Like, that's modeling how difficult this is. And life is actually really difficult, and feelings are going to get hurt, but when you care about people and you care about humanity, you push through it even when it's difficult, and you also compromise. And I think we all did today, even though it's hard.
Thank you. I dropped the mic on that one and ask for a motion.
Motion to move the policy to first reading to the board.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. There's a motion to move to for first reading to the board. Is there a second? With some of the things. And there's a second from Ms. Mahaffey. Thank you. Any other discussion? Thank you all. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, Dr. Chavis. Thank you to your excellent panel. Thank you for coming out here today. And there was a lot of energy last Friday afternoon at Sanderson in that room, I have to tell you. And it was a Friday afternoon at a high school, so it was a lot of energy. Thank you. Thank you all. And I appreciate Mr. Winters and Ms. Wallace for your patience. I think you're going to make policy 6410, organization of the purchasing function, and board policy 6430, purchasing requirements for equipment, materials, and supplies, look easy, straightforward.
Don't jinx it. I remember the mail policy.
Yeah, I know, that's right. Oh, golly, I'm going to leave right now. No, I'm kidding.
Okay, we'll try to get through this.
Well, if these
pretty
are
quickly.
both migration, correct? So
Yes.
I would love for you to highlight how these differ from practice of what we're doing now and from policy of what we're doing now. Thank you.
Just as an overview, these are two new policies, part of the migration process, and they replace parts of other policies, sometimes in whole, sometimes in other policies, sometimes in whole, and sometimes in part. We have a series of 5 policies, 2 of which you will see today, that we will do, and then we will take all 5 at the same time to a first read, so that no policy remains in part.
Thank you so much, Dr. Crane. That way we can both see it as a whole and the staff can implement as a whole. So Mark Winters and Deborah Wallace, thank you for being here today.
Yes, ma'am. So we'll, these 2 policies, there's just a couple of changes that's different from what we have today. And I brought Senior Director of Purchasing, Deborah Wallace, and she's going to go through these with you, and we should get through this fairly quickly.
There we go. First off, you will see the word designee simultaneously through both policies that have been added with the superintendent, so that the superintendent will have the flexibility to rely on her chief of staff and subject matter experts throughout different purchasing aspects in conjunction with the chief purchasing officer. So,
you're starting on 60.
yeah, that was just general between the two policies, I'm sorry. On policy 6410, there are very few things that are different. Basically, they replace 8310, 8311, 8370, and 8380. And page 1, the first paragraph, is adding the language overseen by the purchasing department so that it's clear to all parties that the general purchasing function is the responsibility of the purchasing department. Page 1, number 7, it's combining policies 8310 and 8311 into one statement so that the expectation and the responsibility for the oversight of specifications included within the request fall within the purchasing department, and to make sure that they're in line and that they're spelled out correctly. Excuse me. Page 1, number 9, that reflects language in the current policy of 8370. The addition of the information in red is existing with our current policies and operations for the district, so that's not really a change. It just is pulling those together. So basically, that is pretty much the changes in the one policy that combines the multiple policies into the one.
Thank you, Ms. Wallace. And do you foresee, given that this is part of the migration and just sort of combines, do you see any changes in the practice that, and given the additions that you have made, do you see any changes in the practice that you already do in your department?
I do not.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for presenting. Any board reaction questions on 6410, organization of the purchasing function? Any questions?
Very straightforward. Motion to move to the board on first reading.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. Motion and a second by Ms. Mahaffey to move the new policy and revisions to 6410, organization of the purchasing function, to the full board on first reading. Is there any further discussion? All those in favor, please signify by aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, ma'am. On to the next one.
Thank you. Policy 6430, that's also a combination of 8310, 8311, and 8360. It's a little more comprehensive, but for the most part remains pretty much the same practice that we currently have. Page 1, the second paragraph, North Carolina School Board Association recommended at least 2 bids. Currently, the district attempts to seek the minimum of 3. So we would like for that to remain at 3 bids, and that would allow for additional competition and increased opportunities for small and historically underutilized businesses. Page 1, third paragraph, district staff and legal counsel recommend removing the set amount where it's lined out and keeping with the existing policy so that there's not a cap on the particular numbers that would have to come before the board for purchases, as will be reflective at the end of this policy as well, where Mr. Winters presents a report monthly on expenditures at $250,000 and above. We feel like keeping the language as is with current practice would eliminate and prevent some burdensome types of practices, having to bring multiples constantly to the board to review, with that other report being in place to identify those things at $250,000 and above.
Thank you, Ms. Wallace.
And that's
Dr.
the
Martin,
current
did you have
practice, right?
That's the current practice.
Yes, did you have a clarifying
Well,
question?
that was my question, because the unlimited struck me as a little curious for board approval. I thought that we were supposed to approve everything over $100,000.
So that's for contracts.
Okay.
This is actually items, such as if you go buy $1 million worth of computers,
Yeah.
we just report that out to you. We do not bring that to you prior to purchase.
Okay.
And it would not change the service policy at all.
Okay.
But it's gone through the process
Correct.
that is spelled out here. Okay.
I think, and then just to underline, it is the current process, and it is reported out monthly.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Some of those fun, small type addendums we get in consent items that I always have to expand. Thank you.
One of the things that the School Board Association's policy manual does is it splits purchase requirements for equipment, materials, and supplies and services into two separate policies, so that items, materials, supplies are handled by 6430, and contracts are handled by a different policy. So that is why part of 8360 is covered in policy 6430, and the rest of it will be covered in the policy that we will bring to you, the next policy.
Okay, coming in November. Thank you.
Yeah, that's also our current policy, 8361, has to do with the contracts in this process.
Thank you, Ms. Wallace. Thank you, Dr. Martin, for that question.
Well, and it's just important for the public to recognize that, and actually, budge needs to become budget. But this is for purchases that are already allocated in the budget. So this, you can't just make some new purchase because you want to.
Correct. Thank you.
Correct, yes.
Thanks for catching that typo. I don't
So the good news is, in our financial system,
right,
you cannot purchase anything if there's not available funds within budget because it restricts you.
Right. No, the reason I wanted to highlight that is because this could appear as though the board is giving up authority, but the board has authority over the budget. So it's sort of, you've already approved, you're going to need to purchase this. And so I just wanted to sort of highlight, this is not the board giving up responsibility. It's just tying it with the budgeting process.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. Ms. Wallace, any other highlights you want to make?
Not on page 1. On page 2, the second paragraph, the word responsive is added. That's keeping with the way the statute reads for lowest responsive bidder. So that's just an addition there. Page 2, number B, the informal bid process was changed from 30,000 to the 5,000 to 90,000. Currently, we operate seeking bids and quotes informally from 5,000 to 90,000. There would be what we feel like would be confusion if we were to not delineate that, to say that that is the formal range. Then you still have to seek competition at the $5,000 mark.
So Wake exceeds the statutory requirement. You're seeking informal bids at a much lower threshold, 5,000 instead of 30.
Right, and 3 bids instead of 2.
Yes. Okay. Page 3, number C, the recommended change would be to say the school system rather than the board may refuse to enter into a contract. Again, going back to this is unrelated to service contracts whatsoever, but there are times when we are working with different contractors who may or may not be put on our timeout list that we do not want to do business with, that type of thing. So changing it from the board to the school system still gives the district the authority to not enter into agreements with people that we should be, or they should be timed out. So skipping to page 6. Letter F, this is an addition to the policy. It basically is adding the information, formal sealed bids are subject to public inspection upon opening, and informal bids are not subject to public inspection until a contract has been awarded. The reason this language is in there is formal bids are sealed, so they're opened at one time at a certain date. Informals can come in multiples. They can come email, whatever. We do not want to set the district up for that information to be given to vendors who may decide to change or potentially bid or quote with information from other vendors that have already been submitted.
I appreciate you and Mr. Winters repeatedly being sensitive to that so that we are fair to the vendors that we work with. It's an issue of fairness.
It is. And then page 7, number H, the use of school system term contracts. I've been in further discussion with Mr. Ramey and Mr. Malone regarding the last sentence of this piece. It's probably not reflected on your documents as we were still discussing it today, but we want to change that last sentence to read, if school system form term contracts are used, the board attorney in consultation with the purchasing officer shall review the form term contracts periodically. We work with legal to create the documents that go out with terms and conditions for bids and solicitations, and they feel that on occasion when general statute may change or request from the board to change policy or such, that being able to review that periodically with legal would suffice for what is intended for that. And then finally, the last is J. It's in red, but it is a practice that is currently in place where Mr. Winters submits the report monthly of any purchases in the excess of $250,000 to the board.
Thank you, Ms. Wallace. Appreciate that. So, are there questions, concerns, feedback from Ms. Wallace? Dr. Martin.
Thank you for all the revisions. The one point in looking through these and the old policies, I just wanted to clarify. In Section D, the electronic bidding, it uses the language, the school system may receive bids electronically and so on and so forth. In the old policy, it seems a bit confusing, but it says, as required by law, the board will use the electronic procurement process, and based on the language of the old policy, this was 8360, Section 6. It almost seems as though there were some requirements that everything was going to e-purchase. So the language seems disconnected between the old and the new, and I just want to make sure that we land wherever we are. In the new policy, it does say pursuant to the general statute, but then it uses the word may, and the previous policy will, so I just want to make sure we're in the right place.
Yeah. I believe, and this is my understanding of old policy versus this, the capability to electronically bid for us right now is not where it needs to be with our current Oracle system and the integration with the state. We are working with the state for their new integrated IPS option for electronic bidding. But that is a little bit further down the road for the public schools that state agencies have adopted, and I think some community colleges, but we're still in that infancy stage of getting there.
So the old will language was more aspirational, that they thought it'd be in place by now, and it's not.
I think so, and I think they were leaning more toward the e-procurement process at that point in time than the overall formal bidding process that we can do under the interactive purchasing system.
So I'm assuming, Mr. Blumberg, that the will, it was not necessary.
Right. The new language embedded by the School Boards Association and our firm is fine.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and it's the general statute reads may. I just pulled it up just to verify.
Thank you, Dr. Martin, for that catch.
I will note that 5,000, which we think is the best thing to do. It also provides greater opportunities for more vendors when you have your bid at 5,000 versus individual departments or schools going out in the 5 to 30,000 range and making their purchases without passing it through purchasing and getting additional bids. And we have a high number of items. A high percentage of our items are under 30,000 that are bought, especially at schools. I mean, it's not often that a school has a high dollar purchase amount. Schools are mostly the people. So we think it's best to leave it at the $5,000.
Thank you, Mr. Winters. Any other comments, questions? Ms. Wallace, Mr. Winters?
Motion to move the board to the policy as revised to the full board for first reading.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. Motion by Dr. Martin, second by Mr. Hegarty. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you both. I didn't jinx you. Good. That's not every day. Not every day. And that brings us to the end of our agenda and our meeting. And again, I'm so grateful to this board for the work today. Thank you. And with that, Policy Committee is adjourned. Our next meeting is November the 29th, if I'm correct. All right. Thank you so much.